I grew up in a farmhouse that was built by distant relatives of mine sometime in the 1890s. And in that part of the world, there is an area known as Gantown, which you will not find on a map, but it is the place where generations of my family have lived on the little road that runs between where the house I grew up in sits and the house where my grandmother lived. Gantown is where we used to trick or treat by car, since even had there been sidewalks, it would have taken us days to get places. We'd stop at my grandmother's cousin's house to trick or treat. And we'd be given things like homemade popcorn balls, which I know is what every child longs to get in their trick or treat bag. And then everyone would be invited into the sitting room where the kids would sit on the floor and listen while the adults visited, getting caught up on all the things that had happened since we'd seen each other last. In Gantown, you'll find the original Gann schoolhouse, which is a small clapboard building bookended by shade trees, now blown over by time and the winds that howl across the hilltop on which it sits. Record of its building show that the land was donated and the building was built for a grand total of $12, which I assume means that there was lots of volunteer labor and materials involved too. Probably also donated by my ancestors. Next door to it, you'll find the second Gann schoolhouse, which is a church-like stucco construction where in the 1940s, my grandmother taught relatives and neighbors before she got married. Somewhere in the boxes of pictures that we inherited when she died, there was a photo of her with her first class, all squinting into the sun because they're standing in front of this blazing white building as the sun beats down on them. On the next hill over at Green Mountain Missionary Baptist Church, you'll find Gann Cemetery, established 1856, where generations of my ancestors are buried and where I have had a burial plot since I was 15. Since he has no other plans, I assume Steve will be buried there with me. It's a really pretty place, and if that's where my body is to decompose alongside so many generations who poured their lives into mine, well, then that pleases me immensely. For the first 30 years of my life, I lived very close to my roots, not only on the farm where I grew up, but among people who have known my people for generations. Among people who identified me patrilineally. I am David's daughter and Hurl's granddaughter. And for the last 10 years or so, life has gotten busy and I don't get out to the farm as much as I would like. And I miss my home. As much as I love St. Louis, it is a hard place to exist if you are not from here. It's easy to feel untethered and rootless here. Being plugged in with Steve's family and friends have helped some, and being plugged in with you all has been a great blessing and has helped a lot. But I still find myself searching for this same kind of rootedness that I had in my home place. I've loved settling into our new home for that reason. I jokingly called the place behind our garage conversion the back 40. But I really need my back 40 feet. I need my ancestors and I need to meet them in the dirt of this place. I want to put down roots. I want to be invited into my neighbors' homes and spend the seasons getting to know my soil and what it wants to grow. And please God, let it grow tomatoes and green beans. I want to make jelly from the grapes that grow on our arbor and to take that jelly and make cookies to bring to church events. As Halloween approaches, I wonder, am I daring enough to make corn balls for the neighbors' kids who come to our house to trick or treat? Time will tell. So why am I telling you this? Some of it is that the changing season invites me to notice how I am changing. And some of it has arisen as I've spent the week reflecting on the conference that I attended last weekend. That conference was on embodied theology. Essentially, how does our thinking about God move from thinking to doing stuff? How do we do more with our bodies in the world in the way that Jesus did with his body while he was in the world? How does our theology take on flesh and move into our neighborhood, as the writer of the Gospel of John tells us? The first speaker that I heard was Reverend Dr. Timothy Aberhart, who began his talk by encouraging us to be more pagan, which is quite a way to start out a Christian justice conference. Right? Like, be more pagan. When I hear things like that, I think about like the opening sequence from the TV show Outlander. Have any of you seen that? Where the women are dancing wildly among the standing stones under the moonlight, which sounds like a great time. So I'm in. But what he explained was that the root word for pagan, paganus, actually means rustic or peasant. Yeah, native. Local people whose native spirituality was based around reverence for the natural world. Rustic folks who believed the well-being of the land and of its human and more than human inhabitants was mutually intertwined. More than human was a new phrase for me. It simply means non-human, except in a different hierarchy, right? Non-human kind of puts humans above. And we've been above for a long time. So more than human kind of brings us into a more egalitarian position. Reverend Dr. Eberhardt argued that land-based spirituality is the most common of all traditions. People from Africa, from Asia, indigenous Americans, and even white Europeans had religious traditions based on their land and its more than human residents. How did we move away from those land-based religions, religious traditions? To be able to exploit the land, the exploiters first had to get people living there to believe that the land did not have spiritual or religious significance. The people living there needed to stop seeing it as part of their spiritual whole and start seeing it as a separate object. The exploiters often did this by partnering with the Christian church to educate and civilize the locals, often by force. He used the witch hunts of the Middle Ages as an example, and he says that it's no coincidence that the genocide of European peasants accused of witchcraft happened where the land-based wisdom resistance was the strongest. Basically, the exploiters wanted the riches of the land, and when the wise woman, the healers of the community, said, hold on, this land and these trees and these plants and animals are our friends. They keep us healthy and safe. They are part of us, and you can't just strip them for profit. Those women were accused of witchcraft and killed. The same tactic was used by conquerors in the Americas and in Africa. One could argue that's part of why the West remains involved in conflicts in the Middle East, using a religious cover and the trauma of war and forced migration to exploit a region for financial gain. There is one strand of the Christian tradition that seems to have hung on to more of its land-based tradition. Can you guess which one? Celtic, yeah, Celtic Christianity. The Celts are European Aboriginals, and they were integrated into Christianity much later than the rest of Europe and somehow managed to hang on to some of their holistic resonance and reverence for the natural world. And so those of us who find reverence of the natural world and resonance with that important often find a lot of our spirituality in Celtic traditions. Even with our ties to Celtic tradition and the traditions of Saints Clare and Saints Francis, we are not immune to the consequences of this pattern of exploitation and migration. I'm guessing that most of us, if not all of us, are of some kind of European descent, in part at least. St. Louis is rich in ethnic European roots, Polish, Italian, Irish, to name a few. But how many of us have land-based connections to land-based religious tradition of our ancestors? I don't. How many of us are here on this continent because of wars over resources or to escape exploitation of the human and more than human bodies by the powers that were native to our native lands? How have we dealt with that trauma? And how do we exist in this reality while also living in the reality that our European whiteness has afforded us an advantage in this place where the indigenous peoples have experienced forced migration and genocide for our benefit? How do we live out of these realities in a time and place when our planet's on fire and when the weather patterns are strange and when we've had 500 and 1,000-year floods happen in back-to-back years? I think maybe the answer is in doing with our bodies what Jesus did with his. When Jesus tells us that everything that ever was rests on our ability to love God and love our neighbors, do you suppose he meant just our human neighbors? In his book, The Universal Christ, Richard Rohr points out that rather than descending from above, Jesus is birthed out of creation, like we are. He has a human family. He has a community of people and more than people who are integral to his well-being. Do you think that the God who chose to come to us as a firstborn of creation intended to leave out the more than human from his command to love our neighbors? Or do you suppose that he meant we were to love trees and birds and water and rocks as neighbors too? When you look around and you see the world on fire, does it break your heart? When you witness war carried out in the name of your religion and for the economic benefit of your nation, do you want to scream? Because I do. And I'm grateful that I do, because it means I am not numb or dead. It means I have a chance to keep loving this burning world. Sorry. I get to keep falling in love with trees and rabbits and everything else that calls my yard home. I get to keep learning how to be a better neighbor to the indigenous people who lived here before me. I get to keep unlearning the white supremacy and hetero supremacy and human supremacy and all the other supremacies that have been taught to me. I get a chance to learn about the land-based religion that is native to my people and develop new rituals that keep me rooted in God and in the creation that birthed me. I get the chance to become a spiritual native of the land I now inhabit. If you feel at all like me, maybe you would appreciate some direction on what to do to begin moving in a more rustic, more pagan tradition. Dr. Eberhardt had these 5 suggestions. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you have already done some of these things. Number 1, foster a deep reverence for life in all its forms. How do we fall in love with the more than human? I think it's the same way we fall in love with the human. We get to know who they are, what kind of plants and animals are native to our area. We can find that out. What do they need to live and thrive? Are we willing to sacrifice for them? And can we do that without turning them into another object? Secondly, recover or create new rituals and liturgies based on our own bioregion. How do we ground ourselves in the rhythms of the natural world in this place? I think as people who are already reclaiming a different Catholic tradition, I think we might have a gift to offer others in Christianity in this way. Third, we can learn about the histories of the first people in this region. We live on the ancestral land of the Osage, Miami, Quapaw, and Kickapoo, among others. What are their cosmologies? What are their myths? What are their practices? And how can we learn about them without paternalism or charity, or even a justice mindset, but in humility, knowing that we are in desperate need of their wisdom? Number 4, we can uncover our own ancestral roots. What were the sacred traditions, the land-based rituals of your ancestors? What caused them to leave their ancestral land? He mentioned a book by Elaine Enns, Healing Haunted Histories, where she does this very thing with her own European heritage. And lastly, be on guard against folks who tell us this kind of work is dangerous. This kind of spirituality might feel uncomfortable for us at first because we've been told for so long that it's wrong. But who benefits from that belief? It's not us. What atrocities are done in our name by folks who want us to believe that we have no kinship with the land and the more than human life there. Celtic Christian tradition says this: why were we taught to be afraid of witches and not the people who burned them alive? I didn't want to drown you in resources, so I only mentioned one of the books he referenced as suggested reading. If this sort of work interests you and you'd like me to put together a reading list, I'd be happy to do that. Just let me know. I believe all of the struggles that we are facing in the world now are part of this one struggle, to unlearn the supremacy that we were taught by forces who wanted only to exploit us, so that we can fall in love with one another again and to live with mutuality and respect. We are literally watching a land war and genocide unfold. We are seeing human and more than human life struggle due to climate change, due to flooding and heat waves and fire, and I'm sure weird winter weather heading our way. We are seeing an increase in wealth inequality and the exploitation of the working poor, a lack of fair wages and access to health care. Why? It turns out Jesus was right. Everything rests on our ability to love God and love neighbor. When we gather in this place, I hope that we are not only lamenting the world that is, but also that we are imagining the world that can be. Because we can do something. Following Jesus, we can imagine liturgies that teach us better lessons. We can learn to be better neighbors. We can let our officials know whether or not they're acting in the ways that we need them to. We can help even those who are struggling on all sides of a conflict get the things they truly need to thrive and stop practicing war. It will not happen overnight, and it might not even happen in our lifetimes, but we have to try. For the beauty of the earth and the glories of the sky, we have to try. And so, since there is love that from our birth has wrapped us in a loving embrace, don't lose heart. Fall in love with the world around you. It may not make sense to a lot of people, but that's a solid half of the fun, is confusing other people. Practice neighborliness to the bugs in your yard. Let weeds grow in your flower beds. Let the falling leaves teach you something beautiful about letting go. Embrace the story of where you've come from and where you are now, and work to love God and your neighbors in their many terrifying and wonderful forms. May it be so. Amen.
Amen.